Pirates survived months at sea without refrigeration, while modern people can't keep food fresh for a week. They used 7 bizarre preservation tricks that sound impossible but actually work better than most modern methods. The craziest part? You probably have everything needed for these techniques sitting in your kitchen right now. The first method sounds absolutely disgusting, but works like magic. Pirates had a clever trick with grease that would make modern food scientists jealous. They preserved cooked meat by drowning it in its own fat. This wasn't some fancy cooking technique they learned at pirate culinary school. It was pure survival genius. Here's how it worked. After cooking meat, they'd let the fat cool and solidify around it. The fat acted like a natural vacuum seal, keeping air away from the meat. No air meant no bacteria. No bacteria meant the meat stayed good for weeks instead of going bad in hours under the blazing Caribbean sun. Fat was basically nature's version of plastic wrap, except it was edible and way more delicious. The fat created an airtight barrier that protected the meat better than any modern storage container. Pirates basically invented fancy preservation cooking, except their version involved way more lard and significantly fewer clean aprons. This method worked especially well with pork. Pigs were common on ships because they ate scraps and didn't take up much space. When a pig was slaughtered, nothing went to waste. The meat got cooked, then buried in its own rendered fat like some kind of delicious time capsule. The fat itself became food. When pirates finally dug out their preserved meat, they could use that fat for cooking other things. It was like getting a bonus meal hidden inside your regular meal. The process required patience, though. You couldn't just slap some fat on meat and call it preserved. The meat had to be thoroughly cooked first. Any undercooked spots would spoil and ruin the whole batch. Rush the process, and you'd end up with rotten meat floating in grease. This technique worked best in cooler climates. In tropical waters, even the fat would start to melt and lose its sealing power. Smart pirates would time their food preservation around weather patterns and sailing routes. Plus, it beat trying to eat rope when supplies ran dangerously low. The fat also served another unexpected purpose. It could be used as medicine for wounds or as waterproofing for equipment. Pirates discovered that pig fat was basically the Swiss Army knife of ship supplies. Even the most clever preservation methods had their limits, which leads to another essential survival strategy that involved completely different ingredients. Ship biscuits with beans, peas, and lentils turned inedible rocks into actual meals. These weren't the fluffy, buttery biscuits you'd find at a southern dinner table. They were hard, dry, and could probably double as weapons in a desperate situation. Pirates discovered something that transformed these jaw-breaking disasters into filling food. Dried legumes changed everything. Beans, peas, and lentils could last over a year when stored properly in barrels or sacks. They didn't need special treatment, fancy preservation techniques, or perfect weather conditions. Just keep them dry, and they'd outlast most other food supplies on the ship. These little nuggets were like edible survival insurance policies that actually tasted decent. While ship biscuits provided calories and nothing else, legumes brought protein, fiber, and essential nutrients that kept pirates from falling apart physically. The preparation was straightforward. Pirates would throw handfuls of dried beans or peas into whatever stew they were making. The legumes would absorb the flavors of salted meat and add substance to what was often just water with a few scraps floating around. Suddenly, thin soup became a filling meal. Lentils were particularly valuable because they cooked faster than other legumes. When you're dealing with limited fuel and rough weather, every minute saved in cooking mattered. Red lentils could be ready in under 30 minutes, while beans might take hours. Speed was crucial when you're trying to cook dinner while your kitchen is rocking back and forth like a carnival ride. These weren't just meal extenders, they served a crucial psychological purpose too. Eating the same salted pork and hardtack day after day could break a crew's spirit faster than any enemy attack. A handful of chickpeas could prevent more problems than a loaded cannon. Different legumes offered different advantages. Black beans held their shape well in stews and provided rich flavor. Split peas could be mashed into thick porridge that filled stomachs effectively. Chickpeas could be ground into flour when desperate times called for creative solutions. Pirates accidentally became health food enthusiasts centuries before anyone knew what quinoa was. Smart pirates would trade for different varieties in different ports, building up diverse collections that prevented dietary boredom. Reliable food stores couldn't solve every health problem pirates faced, especially one particular disease that required a completely different approach. Sprouting seeds on board ships turned pirates into accidental gardeners in the middle of the ocean. Not because they suddenly developed green thumbs, but because they were desperate to avoid a horrible disease that could kill them faster than any sword fight. Scurvy was a pirate's worst nightmare. This disease would make your gums bleed, your teeth fall out, and your old wounds reopen. Trying to look intimidating while your teeth are abandoning ship wasn't exactly the fearsome pirate image most crews were going for. The cause was vitamin C deficiency, though pirates didn't understand the science. Fresh citrus fruits were the ideal solution, but they spoiled quickly on long voyages. Clever pirates figured out how to grow fresh food right on their ships using nothing but seeds, damp cloth, and patience. They discovered that sprouting beans and grains could provide the vitamin C they desperately needed. The process was surprisingly simple. Take dried beans, peas, or grain seeds and wrap them in damp cloth. Find a dark corner of the ship where they won't be disturbed. Wait a few days. Suddenly, you've got fresh green sprouts growing in the middle of nowhere like magic that actually keeps you alive. These sprouts weren't meals by themselves. They were tiny, stringy, and not particularly filling. They contained concentrated nutrition that could keep a crew healthy when no other fresh food was available. A handful of sprouts every few days could mean the difference between arriving at port with a healthy crew or a ship full of sick sailors. The sprouting process required careful attention to moisture levels. Too dry, and the seeds wouldn't sprout. Too wet, and they'd rot instead of growing. It was like being a farmer, except your farm was the size of a dinner plate and floated on water. Different seeds sprouted at different rates and provided different benefits. Bean sprouts were ready in 3 to 5 days and provided decent vitamin C levels. Grain sprouts took longer but offered more variety in taste and texture. When everything else on the ship was either salted, dried, or questionable, these tiny green shoots were like finding treasure that grew itself. The timing had to be perfect too. Starting sprouts too early meant they'd be overgrown and bitter. Starting too late meant facing scurvy symptoms before the sprouts were ready. Sprouting wasn't the only way pirates created fresh options from basic supplies, especially when they had opportunities to use fire in creative ways. Smoking food on board or during stops turned pirates into master preservers who could make even the toughest fish taste decent. This wasn't about tobacco pipes. Pirates turned smoke into a food preservation powerhouse that could extend their supplies for weeks while adding flavors that made meals actually enjoyable. When pirates made port stops or went ashore for raids, they built makeshift smokehouses using whatever materials they could find. A few wooden planks, some rope, and a fire pit could create a smoking setup that would preserve enough food for the next leg of their journey. Smoking was like having a magical food machine that ran on wood and patience. The smoking process required constant attention and the right type of wood. Different woods produced different flavors and preservation qualities. Hardwoods like oak and hickory were preferred because they burned slowly and produced steady, flavorful smoke. The science behind smoking was brilliant, even though pirates didn't understand why it worked. Smoke contains natural chemicals that kill bacteria and prevent spoilage. The heat removes moisture from the food, making it harder for harmful organisms to grow. Fish were the most common smoking targets because they were relatively easy to catch and spoiled quickly in tropical heat. Pirates would clean their catch immediately and hang the pieces in their smoking chambers. Getting it wrong meant turning perfectly good fish into expensive charcoal that nobody wanted to eat. The technique required understanding wind patterns and fire management. Too much heat would cook the meat instead of smoking it. Too little heat wouldn't preserve it properly. Pirates had to maintain specific temperature ranges for hours, adjusting their fires based on weather conditions. It was like hosting a slow-cooking barbecue while being hunted by people who definitely weren't invited to dinner. Some clever pirates built portable smoking boxes that could be used on ship decks when weather conditions were right. Properly smoked fish could last 3 to 4 weeks in normal conditions. The smoking process also concentrated flavors, making preserved fish more appetizing than other preservation methods. Plus, smoked fish had the added benefit of making seagulls think twice before trying to steal it. Well-smoked fish was valuable enough to use as currency in some coastal communities. Pirates accidentally became gourmet food producers while just trying not to starve. Smoking wasn't the only way pirates used natural processes to create long-lasting food. especially when it came to vegetables. Fermented foods like sauerkraut or salt cabbage might sound like punishment food, but for pirates sailing in northern waters, these sour vegetables were liquid gold that could prevent death and keep crews functioning during the longest voyages. This wasn't your typical pickled vegetables. Fermentation was a completely different process that created food with natural probiotics and preservation qualities that could last for months without spoiling. The process involved beneficial bacteria that consumed sugars in the cabbage and produced acids that prevented harmful bacteria from growing. Fermentation was like having a microscopic security team that worked around the clock to keep the bad bacteria out of your food. The fermentation process created an environment so acidic that dangerous bacteria couldn't survive, while the beneficial bacteria thrived and multiplied. Fresh cabbage had to be shredded and mixed with salt in precise ratios. Too little salt and harmful bacteria could take over. Too much salt and the fermentation process wouldn't start properly. The mixture was then packed tightly into barrels to exclude air and allow fermentation to begin. Timing was crucial for successful fermentation. The process had to start under the right temperature conditions and be allowed to continue for several weeks. It required more patience than most pirates possessed, but the results were worth every day of waiting. The taste was admittedly challenging for modern palates. Fermented cabbage was sour, funky, and had a strong smell that could clear a room. For pirates facing months of salted meat and hardtack, it provided essential variety and nutrition. Smart pirates collected fermentation recipes like other people collected maps to buried treasure. Different regions had their own fermentation traditions that pirates learned to adopt. Northern European crews brought knowledge of sauerkraut preparation, while other groups had experience with fermented vegetables from their home regions. The probiotics supported digestive health, which was crucial for crews eating monotonous diets for months. The vitamin content helped prevent deficiency diseases that could cripple entire crews. It was like having a pharmacy and grocery store combined in one barrel that smelled terrible, but worked wonders. The sour, complex flavors provided sensory variety that helped prevent the food boredom that could lead to crew dissatisfaction and potential problems. Having something that tasted completely different from the usual ship food was like finding a small piece of home floating in brine. Fermented foods weren't the only unusual preservation method pirates discovered, especially when they had access to rare and valuable ingredients. Honey as a preservative was the ultimate luxury method that only the most successful pirates could afford. When they could get it, honey worked better than almost any other preservation technique available to sailors in that era. The science behind honey preservation was remarkable. Even though pirates didn't understand the chemistry involved, honey creates an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. Its low water content and natural acidity make it impossible for harmful microorganisms to grow. Honey was basically nature's perfect food safe that happened to taste incredible. This preservation method wasn't just about keeping food from spoiling. Honey could actually improve the flavor and nutritional value of preserved items. Fruits, nuts, and herbs stored in honey would maintain their original taste while gaining the complex sweetness that made them more appealing than other preserved foods. Honey preservation was like putting food in suspended animation. Items stored properly in honey could remain edible and flavorful for years, not just months. Archaeological discoveries have found honey-preserved foods that remained edible after thousands of years. The cost made honey preservation a rare luxury. Honey was expensive and difficult to obtain in the quantities needed for serious food preservation. Using honey for preservation was like wrapping your lunch in gold coins. Different types of honey provided different preservation qualities and flavors. Darker honeys had stronger antimicrobial properties but could overpower delicate flavors. Lighter honeys were better for preserving fruits and herbs where the original taste was important. It was like having one magical preservation solution that could handle everything from medicine to dessert. Honey also served multiple purposes beyond food preservation. It could be used as medicine for wounds, throat problems, and digestive issues. It provided quick energy during emergencies and could be mixed with water to create a refreshing drink. Honey-preserved foods didn't need special temperature control or protection from moisture. They could survive the rough conditions of ship storage better than almost any other preserved food. This reliability made honey preservation incredibly valuable despite its high cost. Having access to sweet, flavorful food could boost crew morale better than finding actual treasure. These items provided familiar tastes and textures that reminded crews of home and better times. Even the most effective preservation methods couldn't solve every food storage challenge pirates faced, leading to some surprisingly simple solutions. Vinegar-soaked cloths to wrap food were the emergency solution of pirate food preservation. Simple, cheap, and surprisingly effective at solving problems that more expensive methods couldn't handle. This technique wasn't about long-term preservation like other methods. Instead, it bought precious extra days when food was on the verge of spoiling. It was like giving food a temporary life extension that could mean the difference between a meal and an empty stomach. The method worked because vinegar creates an acidic environment that slows bacterial growth and discourages insects. Wrapping bread, cheese, or dried meat in vinegar-dampened cloths could extend their edible life by several days. For pirates dealing with rapidly spoiling food in tropical heat, those extra days could make all the difference. Cloths had to be dampened with vinegar, not soaked to the point of dripping. Too much vinegar would make the food taste terrible. Too little wouldn't provide adequate protection. Finding the right balance was like being a food preservation artist working with the most basic supplies imaginable. Different foods responded differently to vinegar wrapping. Bread stayed fresher longer and developed less mold when wrapped properly. Cheese maintained better texture and didn't develop the slimy surface that indicated spoilage. Dried meat stayed more palatable and were less likely to attract insects. The vinegar used for this purpose wasn't always the refined product we know today. Pirates often used whatever acidic liquid they could obtain, including wine vinegar, fruit vinegars, or even diluted alcohol that had turned acidic. They weren't picky about brand names when survival was on the line. Almost any crew could afford vinegar and cloth, unlike expensive preservation methods that required special ingredients or equipment. It was a democratic preservation method that could be used by the poorest pirates or the richest captains with equal effectiveness. It required pirates to become experts at reading the early warning signs of food going bad. The timing of vinegar wrapping was critical. It worked best when applied to food that was still fresh but starting to show signs of deterioration. Having a method to rescue food that seemed destined for disposal gave crews hope and a sense of control over their food security. It proved that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most reliable when everything else failed.